So I'll call the meeting to order, which is the 5th meeting of the Corporate Service Committee. And I'd like to mention that the City of London is committed to making every effort to provide alternate formats and communication supports for council and standing or advisory committee meetings for information upon request. To make requests for any city services, please contact accessibility@london.ca, or you can call 519-661-2489 extension 2425. And to make any specific requests for this meeting, you can send an email to csc@london.ca. I'll look for any disclosures of pecuniary interests. Seeing none, we'll go to our consent portion of the report. And I'll move it all together unless anybody has any objection to that. Deputy Mayor Helmer.
Could you pull 2.5 and 2.7?
So we'll pull 2.5 and 2.7, and Councillor Hopkins.
Yes, Madam Chair, I don't want to pull anything, but I do have a quick question on 2.2 when it comes up.
So I'll need a mover and a seconder for, yes, Councillor.
Yeah, thanks. Perhaps we could, I had a few questions about, perhaps we could pull 2.3. And then I'll have questions about 2.2 and 2.4.
Sorry, you're pulling just 2.3?
Yes, please.
Thank you. So I still need a mover and a seconder for the remainder. Deputy Mayor Helmer and Councillor Hopkins as seconder. And are there any questions or comments? Councillor Hopkins.
Yes, I do have a quick question through you, Madam Chair, on 2.2, which is the Court Security and Prisoner Transportation Program transfer. I know this is an agreement that we enter into with the province, and read the recommendation. I know there's a few concerns that staff have, but is this, have there been any changes in the agreement that we have with the province?
Through the chair, this, excuse me, this has been, we've been able to make most of the changes that we've made, but generally this is the exact same agreement we've had for the last number of years that we've had it standing.
Thank you for that. I just wanted to make sure that we, it's an ongoing agreement that we enter into on an annual basis, and I'm glad to hear that it's, I guess, business as usual to some degree with the agreement, and appreciate some of the concerns through the process, but happy to support the recommendation.
Any other comments or questions? Councillor Van Holst.
Yes, on that same item, my question to staff is, we're approving this. What would be the consequence of not accepting this agreement?
Through the chair, if council were not to approve it, then we would not receive the $3 million funding that the grant agreement allows us to receive.
Okay, and someone else would perform the services?
Through the chair, this service is performed by the London Police Services. So we, because of the arrangement that the agreements are with the City of London, we actually transfer the funding over to them. So I believe they're obligated to continue providing the service, and we would be turning down the funding and have to pay for it ourselves.
Okay, thank you. That makes our decision pretty clear.
Any other comments or questions? Mayor Holder.
Thank you, Chair. So I just want to be crystal clear. There'd be absolutely zero reason why we wouldn't want to go forward with this agreement. Through you, Chair, to staff. That's kind of a question and an exclamatory point.
Through the chair, we fully recommend executing the agreement.
Thank you. Any other comments or questions? We have a mover, Deputy Mayor Helmer, and a seconder, Councillor Hopkins. Do we have, okay, start with Councillor Van Holst, and then we'll go with Mayor Holder.
Okay, thank you. I wanted to ask about 2.4, the 2019 annual update on Budweiser Gardens. So we're presently at the stage where we're receiving 70% of the net proceeds from operations. And I was looking through the table. Okay, I was looking through the table to try and find out where the amount that the 70% is calculated from. I just thought I would try and check the math there, and I wasn't able to find that. So perhaps staff could give me a little clarification on our city proceeds. Looks like city proceeds from operations. Where would that happen? So for instance, in 2019 actuals, it's 183,520.
Okay, we'll look to Mrs. Barbone or Mr. Collins to answer that question.
Through the chair, so the agreement is quite large. I think there's multi-volumes that are contained of how this agreement works between the City of London and as part of the partnership agreement. So there is a calculation that is based on the financial statements that adds back a number of items. So it's about a page long in terms of how that calculation is done. So it's not a straight 70% of exactly one particular number. There's quite a number of nuances in terms of how that is actually determined, because it is based on operating cash flow, not just specifically the net number for the financial statement. So depreciation, some non-cash items are added back, and then specific loans are taken off. So we have reviewed the calculation as we do each and every year, and it's not a straightforward one, which is why we've never included it, because it's a little bit circular in some respects.
Okay, thank you. Well, perhaps it might be helpful or possible to stick one other row in there, just so that I could follow it a little better. Maybe I'll have to speak with you offline and look at those things. The other question I had was regarding paying the item off. So we've got about $4.6 million dollars left. It's going to be paid off in 2023, so around $1.2 million a year we're paying on the capital. So does that mean in 2024 will be everything we get from the Budweiser Gardens will be pure profit?
Through the chair to committee, yes, Councillor, you're correct. As part of the multi-year budget, we did take a reduction in the debt servicing costs when that payment is complete in 2023. So we reflect that, and the money coming in that you see on Appendix A, the 300,000 plus, will be coming into the city.
Thank you.
Thank you. So those are my questions on the items that we're passing together. Thank you.
Any other comments or questions? Mayor Holder.
Thank you, Chair. On the same subject of Budweiser Gardens, as is clear on page 143, I want to point out that the budgeted total city proceeds were $146,000. Actual will be almost $200,000 more to $339,000. I think that's extraordinary and certainly helps the bottom line, as it were, but it really is true. It really matters. I will also mention that that Budweiser Gardens, home of the Knights, home of the London Lightning, home of the Junos, back again someday we hope, but also terrific entertainment. It has been an absolute anchor for our downtown, and I think some council prior to us showed vision when they made the determination to put this venue downtown, and it has become an absolute anchor. And I think when we look at how Dundas Place extends to it and the things that we have done, I think this will continue to be a source of great pride and obviously from this revenue. So I'd like to give a shout out to the management and staff of Budweiser Gardens for their great efforts. And I think sometimes that doesn't get said enough when we want to honor excellence. I think in this case, I think they've done one great job, and I'm very impressed with their efforts, and obviously it matters to our bottom line as well.
Thank you. Any other comments or questions? Deputy Mayor Helmer.
I just wanted to ask a question about 2.6 and make a comment. So 2.6 is the renewal of the aesthetic asset management software. And I assume because we're looking to renew it, that it's working just as we expected, and we're very happy with it. I mean, the price seems good, but I want to check in terms of the usefulness and the asset management program itself, make sure that it's meeting all the needs of the team. It seems like a very wise investment in terms of what we're doing with the asset management software.
And that again is Mrs. Barbone, or? Okay, go ahead.
Hello? Yep. So I didn't hear the question, sorry, can you repeat the question?
How is the software working?
Amazing. Okay, so we have been working with them over the past 3.5 years. We're using the software to generate lots of reports that were included in the corporate asset management plan in 2019. We have been very happy with their performance to date. Of course, there is lots more opportunity to expand the use of the software. That's what we are trying to do by extending the contract, making sure that we can include as many service areas as possible, so we can get the best result for all the service area included in the corporate asset management program.
Thank you. Any other questions or comments? Seeing none, we'll call to question.
Closing the vote, motion is carried 6-0.
Now, I'll look for a mover for item 2.3 in our consent agenda, which is the Ontario Works Royal Bank of Canada rights to pay reloadable payment cards program agreement. I'll need a mover and seconder, moved by Councillor Van Hol, seconded by Deputy Mayor Helmer. Any comments or questions? Councillor Van Hos.
Thank you. So on page 49, there starts a section which is entitled Risk Considerations, and I wanted to go through those. It does say that at the end of this section that our RBC is very regulated, so the risks are minimized by that, but I thought it was worthwhile to go through the process of asking about some of them. So to make it brief, maybe talk about number C. It talks about communication methods. The city assumes full responsibility for the risks associated with the communication methods of mail, courier, encrypted documents, unencrypted electronic channels, fax and email. So my question then is, what risks might be associated with those communication methods?
I'll look to Mr. Collins for comments.
Through the chair to committee, when administration was going over the agreement with our counterparts in information technology services and further with the amount of information that our Ontario Works team gathers with respect to our clients, we were concerned with the transmission of any information through unencrypted channels where there could be a risk of someone intercepting some of that information. So part of our dialogue with the Royal Bank of Canada was to see if we could ensure that the channels of communication between us and Royal Bank would be encrypted. And despite lengthy conversations with Royal Bank and their legal counsel, they were unwilling to make that change. However, they assured us, as identified further down on page 50, that they have a reputational interest as well. So we're not going to be communicating anything that is too critical. However, our preference would have been to have any communication between us and the Royal Bank with respect to clients transmitted using encrypted protocol versus being unencrypted.
Okay, well, I thank you for making that effort. Why don't I skip to number E, which is, has to do with the features they intend to detect and deter forged or fraudulent or unauthorized instruments. It suggests that if we don't implement any of those services or features, that might preclude us from making a claim against RBC. So are there any of those features that we plan not to implement?
Through the chair to committee, the short response would be no.
Okay, and I had a question about F. It says that we must immediately notify RBC verbally and in writing of any loss or dispute which becomes aware of in connection with this agreement or service. What kind of losses or disputes would we be talking about? Because certainly we're providing this service to many people.
Through the chair to the councillor, when we took a look at Article 13.7, we were thinking of the definition of immediacy and how quick we would be able to respond, or when a dispute would come to our attention, what that time period would be in terms of immediacy. So we weren't too satisfied with just that immediate, undefined time frame. That we felt that it was unfair to kind of look at committing to that type of item.
Follow-up question?
I'm sorry, I didn't quite understand the answer. So, because this, are you saying that because it's immediately and that's not defined, this doesn't present a problem for us?
Through the chair to committee, we were concerned with the immediacy of, yes, what does it mean that the city must immediately notify RBC of any disputes or whatnot? What is that time frame in their mind of what immediacy is? And it wasn't clearly articulated or defined to us to our satisfaction, so we would prefer that not to have been in that article.
Okay. So, however, we're going to go with it anyway because they've made some further claims about their reputation needing to be protected. So we'll trust them in there. In the financial impact, down at the bottom couple paragraphs of page 51, it gives us a number of the payments that we make per month, and by check, by direct bank deposit. So my question is there going to be a savings by going this route? Because it seems that things will have been simplified.
Thank you through the chair. No, there is no immediate savings by going through this. The processes are still, although there is no check being issued, there's still a process to be able to go through and issue the EFTs onto the cards and to do. So even though the statements, the mailing costs and all the things, we still have to produce the documentation the same way we did previously. So, and there is a cost to using this fee. So any slight savings are offset by the costs incurred for this type of payment form. So we hope there's a slight cost that we have to pay for this, but that is all we anticipate at this time.
All right, thank you. So those are my questions. I will say that I think I like this idea. I think there's much potential for this to be a benefit, both for ourselves and the people using it. So I was still happy to move that and support it. Thank you.
Thank you. Any other comments or questions? Mayor Holder.
Thanks very much. On the same subject, I'm looking at some of the background on this where the province is looking to modernize their frontline service delivery through us. And I note that, that the goal is to, is that 95%, if I've read this correctly, 95% of our social assistance support is they're hoped to be done through electronic payments. Firstly, have I understood that correctly?
Through the chair to your worship, yeah, correct, 95%, the goal, the target is for 95% of our clients to be paid electronically.
And through your chair, what is the time frame? That's ambitious and noble, but I'm trying to get a sense of the timelines associated with how quickly or how soon it would get us to 95%, which is ultimately almost everybody, obviously, but and while there's still a number that may not be. What's our timeline on that, please?
Through the chair to your worship, I have Amanda Straselli behind me representing Ontario Works. Currently, right now, we're about 83% electronically for the direct bank deposits. So it's not a huge 0 to 95% gap that we've got to get to over the coming years. We are monitoring the acceptance rate because we are aware that where people live, they may have limited access to bank branches or ATMs to make use of the card. So as we implement, we'll be monitoring the acceptance rate and the buy-in rate of it, but the overall target is 95%. And I would imagine as the province is rolling this out on a phased basis that we have a number of years to get to that 95%. It's not at the end of 2020. And if our colleagues from Ontario Works can add to that.
Yes, through the chair. So the intention of this program is not to be a reloadable payment card initiative. The preferred method of payment is still direct bank deposit. So our goal is still to increase the number of payments being received through DBD, as well as offer this as an alternative payment for Ontario Works clients who are unable to open or maintain a bank account. In terms of the monitoring, we will be monitored by the province between now and 2023 in terms of the uptake of electronic payments. So there isn't a definitive goal in terms of meeting that 95% target, but between now and 2023, it's expected that we work towards meeting that target.
So through your chair, if 83% are currently direct bank deposit, but not necessarily reloadable payment card, and it looks like that's the direction that that we're taking. I have a couple of questions in this. One is, from a practical standpoint, RBC is the provincial sole source provider. So the 83% that go into electronic payment banking, direct banking deposits, is that through any specific bank currently, or is that the bank of convenience? And as you answer that, I'd like to get a sense of what service charges, if any, are people required to pay if they are part of Ontario Works or various aspects of social assistance? Is there an arrangement where we have waived or had the arrangement waived for fees associated with withdrawals, be it bank, card, or whatever? I'm just trying to get some background on that, please.
Sure, through the chair. So there's no direct agreement with banks in terms of fees for a reduction with Ontario Works clients. Clients may choose to bank whom they wish, and there are, within the 82%, there's a array of banks that clients are using for their service. In terms of fees, it would fluctuate depending on the bank. There are no fee accounts, primarily the online banks, and clients do access those, but we have clients who are accessing banking services from the banks across the city. We do offer right now a check encashment stamp to avoid check cashing fees in particular, but with the implementation of the reloadable cards, that's to mitigate any fees associated with check cashing alternatives at the alternate financial institutions that are currently offering that service.
Yes, Mayor Holder, another question? Or? I think you have to turn off your mic. Thank you.
Thank you. So the old Venerable Canada Trust used to have a Plan 60 account that my mother used to participate in, and it was one of those that there were no fees associated with having hit the ripe age of 60 at the time. They called it a Plan 60 account. But it tells me that as need be, banks can consider that as an option. And ultimately, that's a financial choice. Do we know if the RBC single source contract that has been arranged by the province has given any consideration to reducing or eliminating transaction fees for those who, frankly, when they need it most and every dollar matters to them, any impacts if they took out $10 for this or $50 for that, or went to Tim Hortons and used their transaction card for a coffee, and there may well be a whatever charge. Do we know if RBC has waived transaction fees in this single source contract?
Mr. Collins, or?
Through the chair to your worship, from my understanding with the deal that the province has worked out on the provision of reloadable cards, for clients for cash withdrawal from an RBC Royal Bank ATM machine, they have 4 no-fee withdrawals, so they will not be charged a fee if they are to withdraw from a Royal Bank ATM.
Well, that's nice. Have we had any input on this contract to suggest that there be additional flexibility with associated with these clients? Because I think there's 2 things. If they want to take advantage of the reloadable payment card, there's going to be some conversion, I presume, to an RBC-related card. And if it's an RBC-type debit card and they go wherever, there may well be fees from other branches of other institutions, which we all are used to in our day-to-day lives. But it may not be as convenient for those that don't have vehicles, that don't have transportation. I can't tell you how many RBC branches there are. I mean, they're the largest bank in Canada, but I can't tell you how many branches they have, let's say, in the Dundas corridor, for example. And I'm not trying to prescribe that area as the, and define that as the only area. But I'm dwelling on the transaction fee piece because I think it's important. I think it's important because people who need it most and can afford it least if they don't have the facility of an RBC branch at hand, are going to have transaction fees. And in addition to that, they're allowed 1 a week, which means, I don't know who in this group here, around the table, around the horseshoe, and in the gallery and with administration, use their card more than once a week, but I'll raise my hand and say I use it quite a bit. And so it begs the question for those who might use it to the extent that they've got funds to do it. I've got 2 questions. Do we have any input or any suggestion that we can make to have additional flexibility beyond 4 RBC transactions a month, which feels a little small to me? And again, I'm going to remind us of the client base we have. So I'm asking what our input has or could be. And secondly, what's the process of converting people from depositing wherever they choose to deposit today to this RBC reloadable payment card? I laud the program. I think it's great, but I'm trying to understand those 2 areas, and I think those will be my questions, Chair. Thanks.
Mr. Collins, or Mrs. Barbone?
Thank you, through the chair. So the reloadable payment cards are for new individuals that might access that may not be able to receive direct bank deposit currently. So if someone is receiving direct bank deposit, there will be no change to move them to a payment card. That's not the intent. This is another option to support individuals that otherwise would have received a check that may not be able to under the current circumstances today because they don't have a bank account, et cetera. So from that perspective, there's no transferal process. It'll be completely new cards as we understand it. With respect to the contract and the fees, those were predicated and the province negotiated this contract, and has been rolling it out throughout providers that have been taking this on. So certainly that's feedback we can provide, but based on the contract that's in place, that was negotiated with the province directly with RBC, that is now option for municipalities to take advantage of. So the fee structure is as described. However, that's something certainly I believe Ms. Datersberger and I can take back to the province if there's opportunities to look at that in the future. I'm not sure, I don't recall offhand how long the contract is for, but that is something we can certainly take back. I assume there's a cost structure that is based on those number of transactions, and certainly something we can take back to provide that feedback to the province.
Thank you. I assume that there's, well, Councillor Van Holst has another question.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and through you. So I see that this will certainly help individuals by allowing them to avoid using a check cashing service. So I see that's definitely one of the big upsides. The mayor talked about the 4 withdrawals, and I wanted to follow up on that and ask if the payments are free. So we've looked at withdrawals are sometimes treated differently than payments. So is there a distinction between those two things?
Mr. Collins.
Through the chair to committee, based on a schedule within the statement of work on the agreement, they had listed, Royal Bank had identified what the fees would be for a number of avenues to utilizing the card. So if a client was to use their card to buy goods or pay for services directly with the card, they're indicating that there's no fee. With respect to cardholder support via consumer website, if they were to utilize the card, there'll be no fee. Automated telephone card holder support, the client will not be charged a fee. Moving down, if there was a cash withdrawal from a non-RBC ATM, which is what the mayor was getting at, there could be a $2 per withdrawal convenience fee. So the structure of fees were as part of the agreement, and as you pointed out earlier and we discussed earlier, there were some issues that we had taken with the agreement, but it was non-negotiable, and we did follow up with other municipalities who are going through the same process as we are, and the response across the board was the same, that they were not entertaining any changes to this agreement.
Okay, thank you. So that's good. Certainly a concern when you're making withdrawals. I hope we just inform people that if you're making a $20 withdrawal and there's a $2 fee, that's of course 10% of that, versus if you're taking out a larger amount of money, if you took out $200, it'd be 1%. And so people have to look at their comfort in terms of those amounts of money and how much cash they like to carry on them, because certainly these cards would provide a little more security. And for that reason, I wanted to ask about security. So I think they function like a secured credit card, or maybe better described as a universal gift card. But what security functions are there for the users of this? Is it does it have a tap on it? Is it does there need to be a PIN put in? So how are we protecting these individuals, because they may be quite vulnerable?
So sorry, did you want to take it, or Mrs. Selly wanted to take it?
Sure. Through the chair, it is a chip technology, so there'll be a PIN associated with the card for clients.
Thank you. Are there any other comments or questions for 2.3? It is moved and seconded, so we'll call it to question.
Closing the vote, motion is carried 6-0.
Now we'll go to 2.5, which is the future tax policy and the possible directions that staff could look at after we approve the net levy at the council meeting. I'll look for a mover and a seconder. Councillor Morgan, seconded by Councillor Hopkins. And are there any comments or questions? Deputy Mayor Helmer, sorry.
Thank you. So I appreciate the report. Good to have the context for what's going on with tax policy. In terms of sort of order of operations and when we're going to be making decisions, I just wanted to check in about that. I know there's the overall sort of framework for where we headed longer term with tax policy. Then there's the year-to-year decisions we might make about tax policy for any given year. And is the idea with this report to essentially just receive it for information, we'll make a decision about the 2020 tax policy? Or are you looking for a decision now or soon about where are we going longer term on tax policy?
Thank you, through the chair. So this was really to start to lay out what we have and up to date in terms of the framework and to set the stage. We will be bringing forward the report to set the tax policy in April for 2020 because there's a number of things. We still have some minor items outstanding from the province at this time. So we can't bring it quite out, but I think we've made some small steps towards that. And I think some of the direction that we've received to date has been incorporated into this report. But I think certainly we've outlined the 4 different ways that we could start to look. And if there's direction that the committee would like to, and council would like to provide to us at this time, then we can reflect that in the report that'll come forward in April to either impact particularly for 2020 or to set the long-term direction. So I think up until now, the direction's been quite clear in terms of where we've been trying to go. And there have been some decisions made throughout the time till this point with respect to farm and some of these other ones, which we've reflected here. So I think our intent was to lay this out, get some, I think, feedback from committee and council as to where in the long term you'd like to go if you'd like to deviate from the strategy that has been employed to date.
Councillor Morgan.
Yes, I want to thank the staff for the report. I thought this was a really great report to set the stage for both the 2020 discussion on tax policy as well as the long-term policy that we want to set with some long-term priorities, because I think there's obviously a difference between the two. First off, the one thing I wanted to ask a question of before I make some general comments is the table on page 170 outlines a scenario for the tax levy increase at 3.55%, and then how that would fall out if we made no changes to our tax ratios and included the education numbers, which I assume we have now because you've included them in the estimates. I know that that's taken a little longer in previous years. So does obviously 3.55 is not where we landed in the budget. I think it was 4.4. Do we have, and I don't want to put Mr. Logan on the spot, but any updated sense on what that looks like in this chart? Should we use the 4.4 numbers, how the numbers in the chart would change?
Yes, we do have some preliminary information on that. I think the treasurer indicated she wanted to bring that to the next meeting. We can give you some preliminary numbers if that's what's requested. Do you want to identify a particular property class or?
Yes, I would like to know the numbers, and I'll tell you why after I get them. It seems like a suspicious way to do things, but I'd like to know particularly the residential, multi-residential, and commercial and industrial.
Do you want numbers with and without education or with education?
Yeah, yes, please. I intend on just populating the chart beside the existing values. So if you could do maybe with the education increase, that would be the first column, and then without as the second column.
Okay. This is with the levy, municipal levy, the increase about 4.4, 4.3 I'll read the commercial first, just go down. Commercial, the increase with education was 4.9%, and without education, 6.3%. The multi-residential, and that would not include the new multi-residential, was 3.1 with the education, 3.4 without. And the residential was 2.6 with the 2.6% with the education and 3.4% without the education. And the overall levy increase is 3.5 versus 4.3 in the bottom numbers.
Do you have the industrial one as well?
Industrial is 1.6% with the education, 2.9% without the education.
Okay, so, thanks. So the reason why I wanted to know now is, obviously we just passed a budget. Some people are happy with the investments we've made. Some people are also not happy with the size of the budget increase and how that's going to relate to their taxes. So it's important, I think, for people to know the context of how this will actually impact them at the end of the day when they get their tax bills, because the percentage on their tax bill is the percentage after we make any sort of changes to the tax ratios and apply the education taxes as well. So, so what I see from this is, based on the way that property values are changing, the two main residential classes where people live, residential and multi-residential. I don't know the new multi-residential stream is a little bit different because we basically pegged that at 1. But it looks to me like instead of 4.4, residential is looking at after education taxes more like a 2.6 if we make no changes to the ratios, and multi-residential a 3.1 if there's no changes to the ratios, correct?
That includes certain changes to the ratios. And the changes to the ratios are similar to the strategy that was adopted last year with respect to ratio changes.
Okay, so if we applied the same logic that we applied last year, that's where we would land, is the difference. Okay, so so I think that's important context for Londoners to know, particularly as we move forward with ratifying the budget on March 2nd, is that this tax ratio discussion that we're going to have and we'll finalize in April will be really important to what folks are going to pay. And much like the last multi-year budget, and I appreciate that this year our treasurer put it right up in front in the budget documents, it's very clear that this is an important part of the discussion that Londoners need to think about when they think about, you know, how much they're paying for different things. And the reason why the different classes pay different amounts is because the ratios are different. But I think it's also important for folks to realize, and the report does a good job of doing this, is that property taxes in different classes are tax deductible for some. And also, market value has a different meaning across the different types of divisions within the tax ratios. And of course, and then there's some ratios or some segments that can pass the tax on to, say, their customers if it's a commercial ratio, should they choose to do that. So I think, you know, the report does a really good job of outlining, you know, the differences, the different impacts. But for me, I actually care a lot about, you know, what people pay in the places they live. So that's the residential, multi-residential components. And I think over the past few years, we've done a good job as a council in trying to, you know, manage those ratios in a way that makes a lot of sense. I still am glad that we're benefiting from the education tax changes across the province. I think that provides a little flexibility and relief for folks. But I am looking forward to the discussion. And as we move forward with what the options are, I think you've outlined a number of scenarios. I am interested in the scenario to see, you know, if we did what we did last year, so the one that you kind of outlined here. So I'm interested in seeing that in April when things are brought forward. I don't know if colleagues are interested in seeing anything else, but that's the one that I'm interested in. On the long term, I am interested in having a discussion about some of the things that you've identified in the report, how to manage the two different multi-residential ratios over time. I think that's an important discussion for us to have. I think you've identified that as something we should be considering. And of course, the idea of monitoring what other municipalities are doing for those ratios that might lead to a level of competitiveness for London, I think is a good comparator, and I think you've provided that information very effectively in the past, and I appreciate seeing that in the future, particularly as we develop the long-term strategy. So I know you identified in the report what a couple of others are doing specifically, but I am interested in that sort of information as part of the discussion when it comes forward in April as well. So I hope that helps with what I'm looking for. I don't know if other colleagues are going to weigh in with what they'd like to see, but I understand that the main discussion, both for 2020 and long-term, will happen in April, and that would be where my thinking's at this time.
Councillor Van Hulst.
Thank you. I'm going to ask a few questions. The first, just for a little clarification, comparing table number 1 to table number 2, the commercial and industrial look like they're going down by 0.02, so down from a 1.92 to just a 1.9. And then so 0.02, and then it looks like our multi-residential is going down about twice that amount, 0.04 or so. Is that correct?
The strategy that's going on there is to equalize the municipal tax increase in the multi-res class with the residential class. That's the strategy that was adopted last year, and that's what is indicating what the multi-res ratio will be. And that is correct. It's a little bit greater reduction than the commercial industrial.
Okay. Well, thank you very much. So it might be worth looking again at that strategy for a couple of reasons. One is, as the report describes, there's really no evidence that reducing that tax ratio for multi-residential benefits the residents. So you've described the reasons for that on page 168. The other reason for maybe changing our strategy there is the new multi-residential. So if I imagine someone coming to London and wanting to invest in residential properties, because of our need for housing, I would rather have them build something than buy something. And the motivation there will be the spread between the multi-residential and the new multi-residential. So the closer we have those two together, the new residential, of course, is very close to regular residential, but the closer those are together, the less motivated somebody is to build something new. So I see two reasons why we might want to change our strategy there. The other thing I look at here is the minimum 2.49% decrease. Will in the taxes, what does it take to get to the kind of decrease that that causes the Residential Tenancies Act to pass those savings on? So it seems like there's a quantum that we need to hit in order to assure that residents will get that savings. And can you tell me how our tax ratio might have to change in order to hit that minimum 2.49% decrease?
Not really. It's really a situation goes building by building. What you have there is just averages, and there will be perhaps a few decreases, but with a fairly significant tax increase, I don't think you'll see many buildings that have a decrease in taxes that triggers the rent reduction notice. But there's always a few. But I would not consider that a major consideration in developing tax ratios.
Okay, I see. So it's not just a matter of going up less relatively to what it was before. It has to be an absolute decrease in the rent, and that's not going to happen because they're going up a fair bit. Okay, thank you. My next question might be about farmland. Perhaps I'd ask through the chair to Mr. Logan, just comment on what looks like the most dramatic increase on table 2 is farmland is going up 13.7% and 15.3% here. Now, of course, the taxes on farmland, the ratio is much smaller. The properties are bigger, but I have also heard from residents that that's a concern for some of the older folks still living on their farms. So a comment, if I may.
We did a detailed report on that that's referenced at the beginning of this report. It's the previous reports pertinent to this matter. It's the Corporate Services Committee report, October 22nd, 2019, about vacant excess land and other tax policy issues. That was one of the other tax policy issues we covered in that report. And we went through it quite carefully, comparing tax rates in Middlesex County for farmland and in the city, and our own tax ratio for farmland. What we've done in the past, historically in London, is we've equalized the tax increase in residential and farm in an environment where farmland has increased dramatically all across Ontario, much more so than residential property. And as a result, our tax rates are quite low in farmland, and I believe it was the consensus of the committee at the time of reviewing this report I'm referring to that there probably was not any need to do further tax mitigation for the farmland tax class. The farmland in London has been treated extremely well relative to farmland in other jurisdictions and nearby in other jurisdictions in Middlesex County.
Okay, thank you for the answer, and my apologies to the committee for asking that question. I was away at the time, not receiving agendas, so I may have missed that point. I think those are the questions I had written down here. So if there's, I'll pass this on to my colleagues.
Thank you. And Councillor Hopkins.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and through you to staff, Mr. Logan. Thank you for the updated information. I know we just finished our budget sessions on Friday, and here we are after a long weekend. Really appreciate the updates. I think it's helpful information when we talk about property classes and the changes to our tax levy from 3.55 to 4.4. I think it's good information that we can provide to the to residents when and what they can expect moving forward. I have a couple questions. In the spring, we're looking at our tax policy coming forward. Do we anticipate that our ratio changes may change through the new tax policy, or are we sort of confident that these changes will remain the same? I know that's probably going to be up for another debate, but right now, can we anticipate these ratio changes being what they are today?
We are not expecting any kind of legislation changes from the provincial government. They issued a letter in December 2019 that seemed to set out what the tax policy decisions from the province were going to be for the year 2020.
Okay, thank you for that. And I have one last question. I know we had conversations about the new multi-residential property class and the multi-residential. We have two classes. Could you just sort of explain the difference between the two?
The new multi-residential class refers to the class that applies for any new construction. And it was a class that was created by the province for all municipalities in Ontario to encourage construction of new multi-residential property. And the requirement is that the tax ratio for that property class be between 1 and 1.1, which is very similar to the residential class. And it's a class that's been put in place for 35 years, to last for 35 years. So it's a long-term situation that's going to occur in the province.
Thank you. Councillor Helmer.
Thank you. I wasn't going to say a whole lot about this, but then Councillor Van Holst made some comments, and now I'm going to say a few things. So no need to apologize, because I'm going to go on for quite some time. You didn't take very much time, I think, and you'll see in retrospect. Okay, so I just want to use a couple of round numbers to try and simplify things in the discussion. So the tax rate on apartment buildings right now that are not condos is around 2%. I'm just going to think it's a little bit more than that, but that's not what the education rate, but that's the municipal tax rate on apartment buildings. The tax rate on a single family house is around 1.2. It's like 1.17, but I'm just rounding it up to make it simpler. Because of the way the tax system is set up, it's way more complicated than that. So I'm just going to use those two categories because we can tax them either as a multi-unit residential or as a residential. Those are the two choices for residential properties. We have this third one, which is new multi-unit, is essentially just saying residential. So either you're in the 2% category or you're in the 1.2% category. So in the 2% category is now a fixed universe of buildings. Anything new will get added into new multi-unit residential. So this is a group of buildings that can only ever go down. If they get converted to condos, they get taxed at 1.2%. Now the valuation changes too, which Mr. Logan's talked about before multiple times. So it's a bit more complicated, but they go into the 1.2% category. That's why over time, we've been seeing the total amount of assessment in the multi-unit residential category dropping substantially since 2016 to 2020, which is really not a long period of time. It's gone from 4.8% of the overall assessment. That's not weighted. That's just the normal assessment to 3.7. That's 1.1% of the total assessment in the city has shifted out of the class, right? Those buildings have not been demolished. They've just been converted, right? So they converted to condos. Now they're counted as residential and they're taxed as residential. Also in the 1.2% class are affordable housing projects where we deal with a sort of preferential tax bylaw. Now this is, again, it's a bit more complicated because we're really taxing them equivalent to the residential class. They're not actually, I think, in the residential class. All condo buildings, so any building that has been converted, any building that is built as a brand new condo, whether it is owner occupied or rented, they are in the 1.2% category. And that's why we see a lot of conversions, because building owners look at their buildings and they say, I'm not paying 2%. It's better for me if I pay 1.2 and have the slightly higher valuation, so they convert them. So what's left is really multi-unit residential buildings. A lot of them have been built and been operated for quite some time. And those are the only properties that are left in that 2% tax class. That includes all the social housing buildings that people are living in the city of London. They're all multi-unit residential, right? So we're taxing them at the highest rate. So, you know, the only way this is going to go is it's going to go down. Eventually, the multi-unit residential class is going to disappear because this whole thing has been I think, an unnecessary complexity transitioning from the old way that things were done to some future state. And the question is really like, how fast is it going to go? Once we allowed condos to convert from one class to the other, you could just turn them into a condo and you move classes. That started a sort of one-way process, I think. We're going to eventually find an equilibrium where there's no conversions, and we've reached some point where it's fairness across all the tax categories. Having the new multi-unit residential tax category show up has now introduced this new level of unfairness, which is if you build a new building, you'll get taxed at a lower rate, but if you're owning an old building, you won't. The exact same building, doing the exact same thing in the city. And I don't want to underestimate the impact that tax changes, especially tax ratio changes, can have on rent reductions. Because yes, the average in the class might be going up. And it's getting weird now because we won't have any new buildings going into the multi-unit residential class. But within that class, there'll be buildings that go down in value and buildings that go up substantially in value, depending where they are and what the market will bear for their income earning potential. Last year, in 2019, there were 1,200 rent reduction notices sent out. Now, those are a result of assessment changes, tax policy changes, and conversions. So, I mean, if you convert a building, people are gonna get rent reduction notices for sure. Like that's definitely gonna happen. I don't know how many of those have happened last year. I think it's declining a little bit. If we lower the multi-unit residential tax ratio substantially, a lot of people will get rent reductions for sure. Because it will be shifting the burden so much, so fast that there'll be a big drop in what the property taxes are in the building. And that will trigger rent reductions. In 2017, there were 7,600 rent reductions sent out to people in the City of London. That was the year where the province expanded the universe of what was rent regulated. So now way more buildings are rent regulated than were in the past. And so the benefits can be spread much further throughout the city. So, you know, my own preference is that we eventually and finally, once and for all, resolve this issue around the fairness on how we're taxing multi-unit residential buildings. I think we need to take it down over time. I do think it needs to be gradual enough that it's manageable for all the other property classes, fast enough that it's triggering rent reduction notices, as many of them as possible. If it was so slow that it never really triggered rent reduction notices, that would be the worst kind of outcome, I think. And I think for this year, you know, the strategy we had last year is fine. I think it's appropriate. I think we've got some pressures in some of the other asset categories, but I think in the longer term, what we see with the commercial and the industrial tax ratios is, you know, we're getting down quite a bit below. And I think those ones are ones where people are looking to see, you know, how does this stack up to some of the regional neighbors? And I think it's relevant basically just in the region. We're to the point where we're pretty competitive. And I don't think we're really gaining a whole lot by going lower on commercial or industrial tax ratios. So I think in the future, I'd like to see us really focus it on the multi-unit residential and get that down a bit faster. I think if we took a 15-year time horizon, we could resolve the problem basically going at the speed we're going now. And so I think that's what I'd like to have people think about. You know, is that something we could manage? I think it will eventually get rid of this problem altogether. I think the condo conversions are going to keep happening. They're slowing down, but I think they're going to keep happening, which makes it easier and easier to deal with this problem, right? The smaller the asset base is, the easier it is to shift things around with the tax ratios, the least impact it has on the other categories. And now that it's a capped class, like nothing else can really go into it, they're all going to go in new multi-unit residential. I think it becomes an easier and easier thing to handle. So those are my thoughts. I do think it's a very complicated topic. This is actually, as many people know, the topic of my PhD research. And if anyone wants to talk to me about it, I'm happy to go on and on and on outside of the meeting.
Thank you. Councillor Morgan.
I love talking about tax ratios, so I'll probably take Deputy Mayor Helmer up on that. However, the question I have is something that I forgot to mention in my first comments, and that is, in previous years, we have been advocating to the minister to continue the uploading of education taxes for the commercial class, which was paused, I think in 2012 or 2013, when the provincial government's books became out of balance, or they were going to wait until they were in balance before they reactivated that. There's a new government in place now. I know that we directed a previous year for the mayor to write a new letter to the new finance minister about the benefits of resuming that, particularly in the City of London. And I believe the benefits, and I know I'll ask Mr. Logan to correct me, are in the $11 to $14 million range for commercial properties across the city. Do we have any updates on that, or can we receive any updates on that in April? And maybe the update's just no response, but perhaps we want to focus some advocacy on that again in the future if there's been no signals of movement from the provincial government on that particular piece. Because as you can see in the way that property values are changing, there's where the pressure lands in these these changes is on the commercial property, and it'd be great to provide them some relief through what was a planned uploading of education taxes that was paused by the provincial government. So I don't know if I can get a response to that or a correction on any of my numbers, or when we could receive an update or have a discussion on that again.
Mr. Logan?
Yeah, so it's okay if I?
Yeah.
I was just going to say, I think that's an extremely important issue you're just mentioning there, and it is at a point where the mayor has an outstanding letter with the Ministry of Finance, and we have contacted the Ministry of Finance about a response. We are hoping to have a response to the mayor's letter prior to the completion of the final tax policy report for 2020.
Just as a follow-up through the chair, I hope we get that. It would be great to know what the intentions are, and should that not be the case, I think it's something that we should discuss again as a council, and maybe this is something that we start to think about other ways that we want to advocate for this particular change because of the impact that it would have in the city, and particularly on a class that, again, tends to take some of the pressure off the other classes because of the way the property valuations are shifting, and you can see the commercial class goes up a little higher. It'd be great for some relief to be provided to them on an already promised program that has simply been paused and not renewed.
Thank you. Councillor Van Holst?
Thank you, and through you, Madam Chair. I had a question about condos versus rentals. Will the city generally do better if a new building is made? We get a greater income stream from multi-residential building if it's condos or rental units, or are they very close to the same?
Mr. Logan?
Well, I would suggest that's quite a complicated question. It depends on the type of building and the type of market it's selling in. Actually, we have done reports on this issue of condominiums and multi-res properties, which I think is what you're referring to. You said condominiums and rentals. That's a little bit different, but if you're referring to condominiums and multi-res, we've done reports on that issue and about valuations, and that was in the year 2016. And we did reports, and one is dated April 26, and others January 2016. And as I say, it's a very complicated issue. You'd have to look at the particular buildings and see what's happening, what type of building is coming in, and that kind of thing. So I would not try to make generalize about that in answer to that question.
Okay, well, thank you. I wasn't looking for a generalization, but maybe a statistical edge. Is there, as a city, should we be encouraging one versus the other? The next thing I want to talk about is go back to that 2.49 number for triggering rent reductions. I was encouraged to hear that there was quite a few of those in previous years, or in the previous year. So my question, and something I want my colleagues to think about, when we look at reducing the tax ratios for multi-residential, if that's where we're going to go to, there is the possibility of, rather than reducing them gradually on a year-by-year basis, we could reduce them once every 2 years by twice the amount, or once every 3 years by 3 times the amount. And I think a strategy like that might trigger more rent reductions than just doing it year by year, and that would benefit more residences, just call them renters. So my question through the chair to our staff is, does that seem like a likely scenario?
As I said previously, I would not recommend developing tax ratio strategy based on trying to trigger a certain percentage decrease in the multi-res class. I think you would, there may be a number of rent reduction notices going out, but many of them are quite small. And it's not I don't think it's a significant enough issue to use as a major criteria for setting tax ratios.
Okay, thank you. I'm just aware that some people would like to receive a rent reduction notice. That would be a nice thing to receive in the mail. Go down, okay. All right, I think I've covered my question.
Thank you. So we're going to call to question now. We have a mover and a seconder, and unless there are more questions or comments. No, okay, so we'll call to question.
Closing the vote, motion carries 6-0.
So I'll move to 2.7 Old Victoria Hospital Lands Phase 2. I'll look for a mover and a seconder. I need a mover and a seconder. Councillor Morgan, seconded by Councillor Van Hulst. Comments or questions? Okay, Councillor Helmer.
Thank you. I just wonder if our staff could address the general timeline for what's being proposed here and how quickly, in terms of people who live in the community, what they might expect to see, how quickly things could potentially be changing on the site if we were to go ahead with this recommendation.
Through the chair, so if council decides to go ahead with a tender sale of the buildings on the land, we would expect to have that out within a couple of months. Hopefully receive multiple bids, and we report back to council with a recommendation with regards to those bids. Then there would be conditions associated with the sale. We expect that those conditions would take at least 6 months. Then hopefully the successful proponent would then enter into a site plan approval application process, and that could take anywhere from 6 months to multiple years, depending on what their proposals are. As far as repurposing the buildings, the hope is that this would start within the year, so within a 12-month period, in order to preserve these buildings and start to see development activity on the lands.
Any other comments or questions? Seeing none, we'll call it to question. And that concludes our consent portion of the agenda. We have no schedule. Oh, sorry.
Closing the vote, motion carries 6-0.
So now we actually conclude our consent portion of the agenda, and we have no scheduled items. We have one item for direction. I think the clerk said that he has a drafted motion or a couple of drafted motions. I don't know where council wants to go with this. I guess we'll take up discussion and then we'll have a motion, or if anyone wants to move a motion regarding this item for direction, we are happy to do that. Councillor Van Hulst.
Yes, thank you, Madam Chair. And I wanted to bring something to the attention of my colleagues. I talked about it before in the budget sessions, but there's an opportunity for us to generate revenue, I believe, by providing citizens who are concerned about climate change with some possibilities and opportunities to make voluntary contributions. And I bring this forward because you can go online right now and buy carbon offsets for the kinds of things that you do. If someone were to take a flight to Orlando, say, they might find that it's 0.6 tons of carbon, and at $20 an offset, that would be $12, and you could purchase those offsets and act more responsibly towards that flight by doing so. I also noticed that online there's the possibility to buy offsets for projects that are going on in other municipalities. And this is the kind of thing that we might encourage our residents to do, because the money would be going, of course, towards our projects rather than ones in other municipalities. And I see there being a large demand for this. The other thing we could do is, rather than just offsets, which aren't as valuable for a resident than a business, there might be the opportunity to allow them to make donations to various projects we have going on. And we could provide them, in some instances, tax receipts, so that our projects are funded not only by voluntary funds, but also by contributions in part from upper levels of government as well. So the third method for generating funds along these lines is of course, sponsorship of things.
Sorry, just don't mean to cut you, but we still need a motion before we can have a discussion on this. Are you trying to move a motion?
Okay, so I think I was moving a really long motion that described those three things, but let me make it in a much more
need the
brief
wording.
fashion. Yeah, sure. So I think you'll find wording right in the
bottom.
communication, and that's on page 326. And it's that staff investigate the possibility of generating revenue from a program that that allows concerned individuals to voluntarily purchase carbon offsets that I described, crowdfund green initiatives, and sponsor climate change projects. So that's my motion.
Okay, and we'll look for a seconder. Is there a seconder for this motion? Councillor Morgan. So now, comments or questions? And I will go back to Councillor Van Hulst. So you can finish where you're going with the conversation, and then we'll go to Councillor Morgan after.
Okay, thank you. Well, I think I basically described most of the body of my communication, but it's worth adding one other point here, and that's that the fastest way for London to get to net zero would be if our citizens voluntarily purchased carbon offsets. And the average Canadian uses 22 tons of carbon at $20 an offset. That's $440, an amount that we couldn't add to the taxes, but I note that some people in my communications would be willing to make voluntarily. And if 10% of residences wanted to contribute voluntarily at that level, that'd be $17 million to put towards these kinds of initiatives, which is very substantial, and I think would make them very happy with what we were able to accomplish. I did some surveys during the budget, and half the people who responded said that they would be willing to donate if a tax receipt was available to some extent for that. And I thought that was quite encouraging, and for that reason, I brought it forth to our committee for consideration.
Councillor Morgan.
Yes, so I through the chair, I think Councillor Van Hulst, sometimes he has an idea and then he gets 2 or 3 steps down the road on that idea, when really, what I'm supportive of is step one. And I think that, although I would, probably write the language slightly differently in the motion, I'm comfortable with having our staff look into these sorts of concepts. I think that, you know, there's no harm in figuring out what we can and can't do. I'm certainly would reserve my judgment on what we would pursue based on what information our staff would come back. But when the counselor gave me a heads up that he wanted to move in this direction, I heard his comments at the debate, and I had a conversation with Mr. Murray, because we were talking about budget stuff, and I thought, you know, what could we actually look into, and what couldn't we? And there are actually some stuff here that we could consider looking into. Some might be cost prohibitive, some might not work, some might not be subscribed well. But if the concept here is there a way that we could allow people to, you know, participate in a new way to, you know, contribute to addressing the climate emergency that may generate some revenue for some of our green initiatives or projects? Like, I'm not averse to investigating that. Like, obviously, there's a whole bunch of complexities here on whether it would be a method where people donate to the municipality through a tax receipt, whether that would be, you know, how you would even ensure that we were funding the proper projects through those donations, what we could do, whether there's a way, as things evolve, you know, even within globally with, you know, being able to generate carbon offsets, whether there's a way that we would participate in that. Like, I'm not sure how we want to prepare ourselves or position ourselves down the road, but I'm not adverse to having a couple of smart people on our staff take a look at the concept, come back with some information, and let us know. Whatever committee is most relevant for that to come back to, of course. So I'm happy to support this, but I'm really supporting step one here, and that's, you know, let's get some more information and see what's possible and what's not, and maybe that's as far as we go, but I don't think there's some harm in that. And again, I think Councillor Van Holst's comments are passionate, but there probably some of them are on steps 2, 3, and 4, and I think if we get to step 1, then we can see what's possible for the municipality or not.
Councillor Helmer.
Okay, I just had a question through the chair. I see Mr. Sanford in the back, and I know he's been involved in these things for quite some time. I actually lost track of what happened with this thing that I'm going to ask about, so hopefully he didn't. I seem to remember that years ago, FCM, through the Green Municipal Fund, they were talking about some kind of green municipal corporation that was focused in on the same idea, which is like, how do we participate in the carbon offset market and do this work? I want to say it was like 2010 or something, like a long time ago. But I think it was suspended. Like, I don't know if that ever got off the ground. And I'm not sure if it's being revisited. I know Councillor Morgan's on the board of FCM. I'm not sure if it's come up lately, but I wanted to just check in about, you know, especially the sort of joint venture possibility of municipalities working together to get into that space, rather than every municipality doing their own thing that's focused in their own geography for the residents.
Through the chair, you are stepping back a number of years. That particular program did not get off the ground that I'm aware of. We've not really heard or received further information on that one, but the general concepts still remain alive. And currently right now, the federal government, with their climate action plan in place for Ontario, since we've gone that particular route, these are some of the ideas that are now re-emerging at FCM. So part of what is before us today, we would actually, as part of an update report, would bring forward all those opportunities, not only what is identified here, but some of these other opportunities might be equally as good or perhaps even better. And so any report back like that, we would like to update committee and council with the complete information as we know it. This also, as we did talk about during budget deliberations, is quite an important element of the Climate Emergency Action Plan. We want to be able to find basically revenue sources to bring into the program as well, so it's not just viewed as a cost, and it shouldn't be. So happy to look at all those particular items in addition to what is before us today. And if I may add too, that it would clearly involve legal services and development and compliance, because we do have what's referred to as a sponsorship and advertising policy for the corporation, and that happens to be led by development compliance. So we look at it as sort of a three-party review.
Councillor Hopkins.
Yeah, thank you. And just as a follow-up question to that, I appreciate the councillor's request coming forward here to corporate services, but I know climate change is an ongoing conversation in all departments right throughout the municipality here. So where will this updated report be coming to, and is this the appropriate committee for this, this to come to? And then how do we as a council see all this information coming back to us as opposed to different committees? I'm just trying to understand the process and the updating. Mr. Stanford, if you could comment.
Through the chair, I think this is kind of a two-part comment, and I'll provide the first part. Our last report, as you know, went to SPPC. At that point, we received direction to prepare the plan. In conversation with the city clerk, where we go from there, though, it would be something better, probably addressed either now or at a point in time, but it would be through the clerk's office to find the most appropriate committee to bring the information back to.
Yeah, so that doesn't give me a lot of information in how, where this will go, other than going to staff to review. And I guess it will be determined then through the city clerk's office, if I got that right, where this information on climate change will be coming back to us. So I'm happy to sort of receive this information, but I am looking, I appreciate your comments, Mr. Stanford, and city clerks, to sort of direct us as a committee and as a council to receiving all the information that we need to make these decisions. Because I think if they come here and there in different committees, it's harder to get a really good understanding what we're doing as a municipality when it comes to making policies and determining how we're going to move forward. I think we really need to, as a council, understand it together and get the information that we need.
So, Councillor Hopkins, are you looking to move a motion, or, because we have another motion on the table right now, and it's...
I'm not bringing forward a motion, I'm just following up on the information I've just received now, and I'm happy to hear what this next motion is.
Thank you. Councillor Van Holst.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and perhaps I could address the councillor's question. So there's a demand for people to be able to take more action. There looks like some opportunities here, and our staff has suggested that some other opportunities are available too. I think what's going to happen is they'll look, find out what the opportunities are, and then depending on that, they'll decide what committee it goes to, because it may be different depending on which direction which we go. So, and I'm happy with that. However it comes to us.
Thank you. Mayor Holder.
Thank you. I was always a lousy ping pong player, and so bouncing this back and forth is a bit confusing to me. Perhaps through you to the clerk, could I ask the clerk her opinion as to where this, if this motion has legs, where the best place to put it, to start it, and potentially to finish it?
Through you, Madam Chair. First of all, I just want to clarify, I make the decision based on the procedural bylaw. It's not my decision, it's based on what the bylaw says. And it would depend on what the topic is of the report. Depending on what it is, it may be Civic Works, it might be SPPC, it might be here. It's here today because it was linked to the financial aspect of it. If you wish that report to go to SPPC, you can add to the motion to say the update report, reporting back on this, be brought forward to a future SPPC meeting. I think I was leaning more towards Civic Works based on what the topic is, I understand. But if you wish it to go to SPPC, council certainly can direct that, despite what the procedural bylaw says, that it go to SPPC.
Thank you, through Chair. I mean, that's ultimately the pleasure of the mover and seconder to determine where they would like it. It sounds like Civic Works is the right first place for it to go, and depending, it may go beyond that. But if this is going to pass today, or it may just ultimately be referred over to Civic Works, again, I have to leave that to the pleasure of the mover and seconder, and then determine if this committee is prepared to support it if it lives here. So I can't comment on what their choice is. I will defer to them.
Thank you. So are we looking to add that it goes to SBPC, or are the mover and seconder okay with where it's going, Civic Works Committee?
Potentially.
Potentially.
Depends on.
Councilor Van Holst.
Thank you. I'm happy to allow staff, based on what they find, to send it to the appropriate committee. However, I'm also feeling friendly today, so if somebody's asking for a friendly amendment, I could oblige, but it seems to me that because there's a number of possibilities here, and there's some that we haven't heard of yet, that the staff are contemplating, that we just leave it in their hands. And at that point, at any point, we could refer it to SPPC if we thought that it was worth a discussion with the entire council.
And are there any objection to that? No? Okay, so we'll call it to question. It has been moved and seconded. And take a look at your screen.
Closing the vote, motion carries 6-0.
So that concludes our public session for in our agenda. So now I'll look for a motion to go into closed session. Councilor Van Holst, seconded by Mayor Holder, and we will adjourn from Committee Room 3.
Through you, Madam Chair, I just want to bring to everyone's attention that there was an added reason on the added agenda. So there are 3 reasons for going in closed session, not 2 as the original agenda indicated.
Closing the vote, motion carries 6-0.